Okay, we are back, and we are back at St. Roch Market again. I guess I'll call this, I got lax in not doing the show, so I'm just going to call this Season 3 of Coffee with Kevin, with Emily Ford, and your business is?
Oak and Laurel Cemetery Preservation.
Oak and Laurel Cemetery Preservation. So we are breathing new life into the show by talking about cemeteries today. Thank you so much for coming.
It's my pleasure.
When we were brainstorming ideas, your name came up, cemeteries. I'm like, I've got to have that on the show. That is so important to me. I love that. So, but one of the things that got me, you're from Florida.
Yes. No, I'm not from here. I've lived here for 7 years. And I do like to make the joke that my parents got engaged here, actually. They got engaged at the French Market restaurant because they're terribly romantic. And but we came up here every year as a kid, as a child. So I like to say I have a little bit more of a connection. But I've only been here for 7 years.
But so you redo cemetery tombs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, restoration, preservation.
So and my family, we've got cemetery tombs all over town. They start to stack up after a while. So basically, if I have a tomb that's collapsing or falling down because they're old, I would call you, and you redo those tombs.
I do restoration, preservation, for collapsing tombs and not collapsing tombs.
Okay, you mean just touching up in that?
Yeah, a lot of times, especially recently, I'm getting a lot of folks who just want a quick lime wash, maintenance, which is great that people are focused on doing that too. It's important.
I guess, so one of the interesting things, so my father is buried in St. Louis number 3. And when we were bike riding, and there's always tour buses around, and he actually died during Mardi Gras. We had to get through a parade to get to the cemetery and stuff. And anytime we go there, we got to wait for a tour bus to move, to drive in, and so my wife, we were bike riding, and she's like, that must really bother you that you have all these tourists. And I was like, maybe, I never thought about it. I never thought that that's not something. So, but it is people want to come and see New Orleans' cemeteries. They're so, but to me, I can't conceive of it I'm saying it's nice to have you from the outside because I can't conceive of cemeteries any other way.
Well, isn't it? It's kind of funny because we have sort of this dichotomy of our cemeteries in the insular sense, in the inward-looking sense, and our cemeteries as presented from an external gaze, right?
Okay.
So you have your cemetery, your experience where your father's buried. You see that cemetery very different than the people who are going to be bringing in tour buses, right?
Right.
They see it as a spectacle, which is good. It's important.
But I do see it as a spectacle. It's cool.
Yeah.
And there's something really special to me about the tomb itself being, a genealogy.
Yes.
It's where I guess I'll end up. You know what I mean? And then I have generations of my family that I can go visit, and I know exactly where they are. They're in this box, you know. And so it's very I can't conceive of everybody in the family being spread out everywhere.
Yes,
you know what I mean?
course.
There's something very interesting about them all being in that
and something
area.
very precious about that. That's a lot of my families. The tomb I'm working on right now, bought in 1843. The lot was bought in 1843. We didn't even get into this yet. That a lot of burials, you were talking about having German ancestry. German and Irish folks actually really didn't care to be buried above ground. They wanted to be buried below ground. So this tomb, 2 below ground burials, 1867. Their kids are New Orleanians. They want a tomb. This tomb had a burial in it last year. So for 170 years, this tomb has been used. So that is precious. That's really it's a really important part of our civic life, right? To be able to visit that and reconnect with our family in the city.
And if you're redoing tombs and people are building tombs and that you hear that the cemetery is like a museum.
Yes.
But it's not.
It's really not. They're so dynamic. Actually, the tomb I just mentioned, little headstones, big tomb. There's actually a tomb in Lafayette number 1 that has a shed addition on it. They built a little extra on the side. Like you see on a house. There's everything that you see in a New Orleans cemetery is not the first thing that was there. St. Roch is actually an excellent example.
Okay.
If you see photos of St. Roch from about the 1880s, it's entirely below ground. It's
Okay.
entirely below ground.
Because it was a German
It was a
cemetery.
German cemetery, and it's very grassy,
Uh-huh.
and there are wooden headboards everywhere, no
Really?
marble. And then that changes in the 1920s. We have a totally a revolution in how we do construction in cemeteries. So they're not museums necessarily as, the way that I say it is you're not traveling back in history. You're traveling through every day between now and then.
Uh-huh.
It's much more dynamic than that.
And the cemeteries are, and so for me, I can go, like if I go with my grandfather to my grandmother's in St. Vincent de Paul. So when we've gone there for
All Saints Day.
All Saints Day. He'll, this person's this, and I'll live down the street from these people, and I mean, like, he knows all these people. And then we run into, like, other people that we knew from St. Bernard that grew up in the neighborhood that I knew from and so it's a neighborhood.
It is.
But they're dead, but it's a
Yes.
neighborhood. It's
yes,
incredible.
well, it's truly a necropolis. Yeah, and that's really one of the most, that's the cemeteries provide a service. They still do. They're not these little static museums that we have somewhere in our neighborhood.
Or tourist traps.
Or tourist traps, which sometimes there can be conflicting motivations there, right? Conflicting goals, where maybe if you're packaging it as a tourist attraction, like maybe there is some disruption of that civic use, but not always.
Yeah.
Really, that's what's so important about them. You're reconnecting with your family, you're reconnecting with your old neighbors, especially when you have neighborhoods where there's a lot of population movement, like say with St. Vincent de Paul.
Yeah.
A lot of folks don't live there anymore, but they still have this connection.
Yeah, you go see people you know. It's incredible. How do I see people I know in the cemetery? It's wild.
Oh,
it's true.
And it's always been that way. I did a tomb last year, the Reinhardt family tomb, which the descendant lives in Meridian, Mississippi now.
Okay.
But the Reinhardt tomb is across from another Reinhardt tomb. And I was like, I know the other Reinhardt. Maybe I should put you guys in touch. They're cousins. They didn't know each other. But people would buy tombs near their neighbors, near their relatives. So not only is it a good genealogical thing, like what you're saying, seeing all your family, but then you see the other tombs, you're like, maybe I might be related to that guy,
That's because okay. So we're, people think, okay, you live and you die and you go to the cemetery. But the weird part is like, so you're saying that the cemetery is it shapes the neighborhood that it's in.
Absolutely.
And I mean, I guess the most perfect example of that, so this was not always St. Roch Avenue. This was that St. Roch, and it's even St. Roch's apostrophe S cemetery, whereas this is St. Roch Market. It was built to service the neighborhood.
Yes.
And the neighborhood basically got the name from the cemetery. Because the cemetery was, and I know this, was Trinity Cemetery.
Yes. Well, and not only that, but the
Holy Trinity Cemetery, the Maroney Opera House, that church.
Yes.
The people.
the Maroney. Mm-hmm. I always forget that.
Yeah.
The chapel. See, and St. Roch's like probably one of the best examples because the chapel was a pilgrimage place. It was a place where people would come and visit. Actually, people from out of town. They made little postcards. You could buy souvenirs, and like to the point where yes, that is very much a neighborhood anchor. And it was also green space. It was places where like people could go like as a public park. In a lot of ways, you see photos of that.
And my mom tells me stories all the time. When she was a little girl, they'd go picnic out by the cemetery, by the tomb.
There's one family in Lafayette, number 1, that she brings her little babies every year on All Saints Day, and they picnic.
They go
and yes, do that.
Because my dad, I remember saying like they'd go and wait to see like who shows up because other people would come.
They would set up.
Oh, I haven't seen y'all since last year. How's that? Yeah, it's.
The expectation was that you put out a couple chairs for Grandma and Grandpa. This is at least the stories I hear. People confuse the way that All Saints Day worked too. The idea was to have your tomb fixed up before All Saints Day, so when the neighbors came by, they'd look.
It would look nice, yeah.
But you would still post up, and the kids would be able to go play. Adults would be able to like plant flowers and beautify the tomb. And then old folks would sit in chairs and they would basically hold their own court. Like actually. A lot like Parade Day, where people would be. This was a social occasion, and it still is.
It still is.
Yeah.
It totally still is. Go through any cemetery on All Saints Day. It's you're gonna see all kind of people there. It's so interesting. And I think that's one thing that people miss, or at least just even me when I'm thinking of cemeteries, it's a cemetery, not how that cemetery affects the living.
Yeah.
You know, and it's so New Orleans, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, it's there for the living. I mean, the dead don't really have any use for it, do they?
That's
I mean,
true.
other than
That's true.
But it is there for the living, and like we, especially like say Lafayette Cemetery #1, and some of the archdiocesan cemeteries. There is such a tradition of visiting, like a visitation, like, and they're almost invisible. Like we sort of lose that sometimes. I think it's very easy to look at some of our cemeteries and behave as if everything here is abandoned.
Yeah.
And they're not. They're really not.
It's a dynamic living thing.
Absolutely, and people come all the time. I am always surprised.
St. Louis #1. Let's
Yes.
talk about St. Louis #1. That's the granddaddy of all of the
It is, well, literally,
cemeteries. Quite literally, the granddaddy of all of the cemeteries. It's you can't get into it anymore. What's the deal?
So the restriction on St. Louis Cemetery #1 started in 2015.
Was it because of the Marie Laveau thing or what?
Vandalism. Well, actually, see, that's the thing is that there was a different event that happened that was supposed to be the precursor to why they closed the cemetery. It didn't actually have anything to do with Marie Laveau.
Okay.
Which it was a weird situation. That's just like I still haven't gotten the police report for it, so I couldn't say anything.
Okay, all right.
One of these days, I'm going to get that police report. But it was still just the idea of like this has become an unsustainable situation. We're closing the cemetery to unaccompanied tourists. Everybody has to come in with a tour guide, so that's how it works now.
Okay, and so because you can't just go through.
No,
But you were talking about what is that, Lafayette?
Lafayette #1 is accessible to everybody.
But you were saying it's up to 500 tourists
Yes.
in there at any time. That's
Yeah, there are
incredible.
actually two different, really big two extremes. St. Louis #1, as far as I'm concerned, like maybe there's some issues that could be worked out in terms of how to make the cemetery accessible to people who have family there. 'Cause sometimes it does get a little bit complicated.
Because I mean, there's buku people in that cemetery, right?
Oh, gosh.
I mean, and that's probably what this. I mean, it's 300 years old, whatever it is,
Yep.
and so like you've got these books, and so probably like all of the records are just like buku people, right?
Yes. Oh
That's
gosh.
what's-
Well, I mean, there's not even records in a lot of situations. But the way I was speaking to somebody about this yesterday, if you had a family member who died in New Orleans between 1789 and 1822, there was only one cemetery in which to place them. So, and they're in St. Louis #1,
Yeah.
whether you know where they
Whether
are.
there's a piece of
specifically.
document or not. Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, it's a very crowded cemetery. So I think that's where maybe that there was like sort of an error on the side of tourist access that maybe came at the expense of people who have family there, as opposed to Lafayette Cemetery #1, which can be. I mean, at any given point in time, there's about 300 to 500 people in the cemetery. And that can be a little bit daunting for families who are coming to visit.
Yeah.
Especially when you have like mobility
See, but
issues.
me, but like, because like I was talking about my wife today, I mean, it just never occurred to me. I just always have seen tourists in the cemetery.
Yeah, well, there's plenty of tomb owners that love the tourists. Like, I have a couple clients who love to regale people and love to like tell fun stories about their tombs.
I must say, and especially, for me, the fact that people want to come here and see a part of me is, I don't think people go to anywhere else in America to see that sort of thing.
Well, the important thing is that they see that part of you as a person who lives here, as opposed to
like they want to see that. They want to spend their time to see
as long as
this.
it's presented in the right way. As long as it's presented in the way where we say, like, this is living human. This is a person who lives here. They have a stake in this, and this is their space, and they are sharing it with you. As opposed to, let me show you where vampire Lestat is buried. Because then you end up in a situation where, if I may explain how I think this goes.
Okay.
I think that many people visit our cemeteries because a tourist guide told them to go. I always say, like, the internet told them to go. I think a lot of people visit our cemeteries and they don't visit cemeteries elsewhere, right? So I think that there is some discomfort, right? There should be. If you are human, being in a cemetery should somewhere feel a little bit uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And I think that when folks visit the cemeteries, they don't exactly know how to behave, right? There's because they're in a different space, like we look for some sort of cue, right?
Right.
To like show us how to behave respectfully in that kind of space. When you have tour guides at the entrance of the cemetery telling you, let me tell you where vampire Lestat is buried, they're catching these cues that they are in an abandoned space That's like a movie set. It's not real.
Yeah.
And that's where you end up with some situations where maybe we're missing the point of what the landscape is there for. And we get some like sort of disrespectful behavior, some vandalism, and also some incidents where, say, maybe family who are mourning very recently passed people don't have the space to do that.
Yeah.
So that can be problematic.
Because they're living. This is not a movie set. It's a real life cemetery.
We're real. Yeah.
This is people we buried.
Yeah, and I think that if we can just be mindful of the cues that we're giving people, then tourism can be very, very useful in but the people who have family buried in these tombs are first.
Yeah.
I can tell you a story about a man who buried his wife in Lafayette Number 1. And not even the next week, somebody was standing in front of the tomb saying there was just a burial here. And the man is standing across the aisle waiting for them to leave. It's very heartbreaking. It's a very upsetting story, but that's sort of the situation that sometimes if we're not careful, we can...
So there's a lot of difference. So how do we, I guess, so what you're saying, it sounds it's very important. How do we go about, is there any way to go about changing that? There's so many different cemeteries that are owned by different people. How do you change the...
Well, there's a lot of things. I think there's a lot of things that the Archdiocese is doing right. I like that they do have... Because the Archdiocese does have the whole religion thing on their side. So they can at least evoke that reverence, that sense of reverence, because we have a model for that, right?
Right.
People can see that and they're like, okay, I behave as if I'm in church.
As
opposed to Vampire Lestat Cemetery, where I have haunted history guy who is maybe giving me different cues. So I think that we can foster a culture of maybe being a little bit more, like stepping a little bit more carefully. I think it starts with the tour guides. I think that's where we're at this point. And there's some great tour guides, and really what I like to do is kind of amp them up. Like, I like to foster them, I like to talk to them, I like to share information with them, because then maybe somebody else will hear them. Maybe somebody else will sort of emulate them, right? We all go off of cues. It's all social mindset. So finding a way to do that. And then I think that there are probably ways that we can do it officially. I think that the city of New Orleans could invest in their cemeteries, which we're not really in that kind of situation yet. And I think we should staff our cemeteries, hands down, absolutely.
And have people that are there to...
Sextons.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with the term?
No.
Okay, they used to be caretakers. And that was the case for all of the cemeteries in New Orleans. St. Roch had a man who worked in that cemetery and lived nearby.
Okay.
St. Vincent de Paul, around the corner, the Suarez brothers lived there. They were the caretakers of the cemetery. I had the chance to interview the Alfordish brothers, Dan and Henry, who are Alfordish Marble and Granite in Gretna.
Okay.
They're fourth generation stonecutters. Dan was born in St. Joseph's Cemetery.
Wow.
His family lived in it. This was the case until the 1940s, 1950s. And then we removed that kind of anchor of the cemetery. If we have somebody who's present, and we do in some cemeteries, in St. Vincent de Paul, there's a guy who's there as a caretaker. He makes people feel safe. He's there, right?
Yeah.
In St. Roch, there's a couple archdiocesan cemetery guys who are just the sweetest, just like good-hearted people, and they make the landscape what it is, right? Like, people see them, they feel accepted, they feel like part of the space.
And they're giving them the social cues of what they need to be doing in that cemetery.
Exactly.
And I tell you, it's such a interesting thing, and you know, we'd love to talk about our neighborhoods in New Orleans, and like those are, it's where everyone from the neighborhood kind of ends up in their neighborhood cemetery.
Well, and that's another thing that we can do is, sounds a little bit macabre, but assure that the people who live in the neighborhood now end up there, like that they're invested in having these spaces as contemporary.
It's a sense of
resting.
pride, essentially.
Yeah, well, but even like so.
Because I am proud of the fact that people want to come see St. Louis Number 3.
Yeah, and that's your space.
Yeah.
I think that so. In the sense that we have so many.
Like people that come see my coffee shop. The same thing. I mean, it's neat when people come. I mean, we have people from London now that they have the flight coming back and forth from London. We have people from London. It's like, our friends, you know, they speak British or whatever.
Yeah.
But they're like, our friends who came here and they said you had great tea, and they're here getting tea. And I'm
you
like,
actually do have fantastic tea.
Oh yeah, you are drinking tea. Yeah, thank you. So it's kind of funny, like, you know, like that. But it's the same kind of thing. Like I love New Orleans, and I love to share it with people.
Yeah. Well, so what I think would be for all of the people that we have moving here, and I actually run into people in Lafayette number 1 this way, where they live here, they bought a house in Irish Channel, Garden District, and they want to be buried in Lafayette number 1. They can't. Like, unless they literally buy a tomb from a tomb owner, which people do sell tombs.
Yeah.
However, there's no real easy way to do that.
Yeah, it's. I know I think we have one that we could maybe sell, but
you were talking about it.
Yeah, it's got
chance?
people in it and everything. Yeah,
well, you do have to remove remains,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah, yeah.
But that's not the hardest part. The hardest part is advertising it for sale, and I
Craigslist. That's where they go.
Or actually, I spoke to somebody about this, an older gentleman who wants to sell his tomb. It's a beautiful tomb. Like, it should be used. However, he was like, so what do I do? And I was like, so far, the best thing I've seen to work is putting a for sale sign on it. And it works.
People walking around like, I'll take that.
Yeah. But one, I mean, they're valuable structures. They're useful structures. We have a finite amount of space to bury people in the city. So, I mean, like, that is an important thing to make sure that you have some value in that.
Right.
But also, if there are different people living in the city, in the neighborhood that a cemetery is servicing, that should be their cemetery too. That should be their burial place, right? That so like, how do we adopt it into being contemporarily relevant? That's how you do it. But in the case of the city cemeteries, they won't sell property.
They won't sell property? The city won't sell property?
The city Department of Cemeteries is pretty much only responsible for cutting the grass and opening and closing the gates.
Okay.
And they farm out the grass cutting. That's a contractor. So, like, there's basically no...
Somebody's brother-in-law if it's a city contract.
No, but the grave diggers are.
Oh, okay.
And they are. And they're great guys. But the thing is that we don't have a very big investment in the city cemetery. Again, the city of Savannah, Georgia has in my opinion, a much better model in which the city of Savannah, Georgia is in the business of cemeteries. The first thing that they did when they took over these cemeteries, this is Bonaventure Cemetery, which is the Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, Bird Girl. The first thing they did is they bought a giant parcel of land separate, like beside Bonaventure, and they opened a new cemetery. So now they have new sales, they have a burial crew, they actually have an entire self-contained...
So you're saying we could do better about being in the business of death in New Orleans?
We could do anything. We could open one more gate and we'd be doing twice as much as we're already doing. There's really not a lot happening in the city-owned cemeteries. Like, to the point where I work for the Oddfellows, and the person that I work for in the Oddfellows says the one thing that I want more than anything else is for this cemetery to not get worse under the time I am caring for it. Which is a beautiful sentiment, right?
Yeah.
The city-owned cemeteries are getting worse under the maintenance, under the
current,
city, yes. Now, Mark Morial, actually, he did a lot of stuff in the 90s, and he had a lot of interest. My hope is that with the new mayoral administration coming in, that maybe we'll have a good fresh slate where we can contact...
Well, it's an important part of life in New Orleans.
It is so important.
It's funny. It's an important part of life in New Orleans.
It is. It absolutely is. Even beyond from what we're talking about, like, a lot of people are concerned about safety in cemeteries, which personally I think a lot of times that might be a little bit more of like a specter that we don't really understand, as opposed to the reality of safety. However, you've heard of the broken window theory of criminology?
What do you mean?
The idea of, like, if there's a broken window in a neighborhood and nobody fixes it, it sort of gives off criminological cues that people think, oh, well, nobody cares, so I can do other things.
Gotcha.
So the idea is, fix the window, you'll have less crime.
Yeah, okay.
Now, admittedly, law enforcement has totally misunderstood what that criminological theory is. So when people say broken windows policing, it's not the same thing. However, it should be called the abandoned cemetery theory. Because if a cemetery looks, say, like overgrown, and this is a good example, is Lafayette Cemetery number 2 on Washington and Loyola. If a cemetery is overgrown, if it, say, is vandalized severely, people are more likely to
continue to vandalize it.
Absolutely.
If there's X's on Marie Laveau's tomb, I'm going to feel more inclined to put more X's on Marie Laveau's tomb.
You can use language in your program.
Cool.
I always say nobody wants to be the first asshole to put marks on Marie Laveau's tomb. So if you keep those removed, then you have less of a chance of I mean, that's just criminological theory.
So well, and your work is phenomenal, Emily. Thank you so much for coming.
It's been my pleasure.
And I'm going to put a link to your business or whatever right down below.
Yeah, I run a blog, so like if any of this information is interesting,
I'll put all the links. I'll put the links down below, and if anybody needs a tomb restored, the links are there. So
well, thank you.
Thank you so much for coming. I appreciate it. Take
It's been
care.
so much fun.